So thank you for joining us again tonight here at the MacKillop Centre. Let us first acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This evening, we're delighted to welcome again our very own Robbie Tulip, a loyal Jung Society presenter. He does the library, he does the entertainment, he does all the extra bits and pieces too. So he was fabulous to have on in our team. Thank you, Robbie. Robbie will talk about Carl Jung and Jesus Christ in a moment. I'll get you before we get Robbie in. Jesus is the centre figure for Carl Jung's spiritual psychology as a symbolic archetype of salvation in the collective unconscious. Robbie will analyse Jung's commentaries on Christ against theological, psychological, cultural, and history context. So I'll just get you, Francis, come in and then I'll introduce you. Okay, we'll do that. Yep. So Francis will come in first and then we'll introduce Robbie.
We've got books by Canberra Orphan Nina Tavanito about the Cossack, explaining a little bit of the history of the Ukraine, going back hundreds of years, and we hope leading to greater understanding. Nina will actually be interviewed on 2XX, the community radio station, tomorrow morning, Saturday, with some Ukrainian music. So they're available at the back.
Thank you very much. $25. Yep. So I'd like to continue on with Robbie. Robbie is a national director of the Australian Student Christian Movement. He's a secretary of Canberra Region Presbytery of the Uniting Church. He's a manager of the ANU chaplaincy. He's a convener of the Planetary Restoration Action Group and a regular presenter with the Canberra Jung Society. He comes every year to do that, but he does also the entertainment and keeps us all amused. He's worked in international development for many years and has 2 university degrees in philosophy. He's a master's in philosophy, so, yep. Robbie's presentation and activities will go for about an hour. Then we'll have a short break, and then you can have a short break of eating the goodies over there and move on to discussion and questions. Note that we'll be recording this event for later reference. If you want to go over things again, you can do that. And if you're here on Zoom, please remain muted while Robbie is speaking. Use Zoom chat for comments, and we'll open up later for discussion. Thank you, Robbie. Thank you, Robbie, very much.
Thanks very much, Jane. And I'd just like to also acknowledge Indigenous people before we begin and their heritage. So, Carl Jung and Jesus Christ. A core question in the psychology of Carl Jung is the relationship between the ego and the self. The ego, in Jung's interpretation, is who we think we are, while the self is who we really are. Now, the ego can live quite effectively in a secular materialist world, but the self occupies more of a psychic reality that has as much validity and reality as the scientific world of matter. We experience the world through our minds. We combine our conscious perceptions with unconscious intuitions and influences that shape our personality and our culture. The totality of the self, in Jung's understanding, can also be referred to as the soul. Jung interpreted Jesus Christ as the archetype of the self, the ideal of human personality, integrating conscious and unconscious realms. In this talk, I'll study these questions by drawing on a book by Wallace B. Clift titled Jung and Christianity, The Challenge of Reconciliation, is the cover. And then I'll share some of my own reflections arising from this rich material, looking at how the collective unconscious can be grounded in astronomy, and concluding with some suggestions about climate change. Jung discussed God in terms of what he termed autonomous psychic complexes. Now, this was not to suggest that God or divinity is a subjective construction of the mind, but rather to explore how our language about religion reflects universal psychological structures that include unconscious and unknown elements, as well as our conscious rational understanding. The complexes of the soul contain features that are universally shared by humanity, with what Jung called numinous clusters of associations and meaning. This is what Jung meant by his idea of the archetypes of the collective unconscious, with the spiritual heritage of human evolution born anew in the brain structure of every individual. Tuning into these archetypal patterns of experience enables us to find meaning and spiritual healing in images of wholeness that well up from the unconscious. We can find a path to repair the loss of meaning that pervades modern life. Opening up to the unconscious can dissolve blockages in our psyche and allow meaning to emerge into awareness, helping to explain and treat the trauma created by delusion, and I think especially delusion within religion. From his collaboration with the renowned physicist Wolfgang Pauli, Jung contended that just as physics is discovering the unknown side of matter, so too complex psychology is pushing forward into the unknown side of the psyche. This analogy between mind and matter points to an integrated and systematic approach to reality, recognizing the transcendental background of empirical reality in a unified theory of being. So Jung is finding some quite profound philosophical ideas in his psychology. Looking at how the two sides, mind and matter, relate to each other, Jung argues that the spiritual and the biological must be integrated to overcome the materialistic reduction favoured by modern secular philosophy. His psychology sought a practical meaning of truth, assessing phenomena of spirit together with the objective findings of science. Basic concepts in Jung's psychology emphasize the central role of spirituality. Wallace Clift explores Jung's description of a psychologist as a pastor of souls who helps people to find meaning in life. The psyche needs to find an equilibrium between the conscious and the unconscious. And this equilibrium emerges in psychological energies such as libido and the shadow. These are more than instinctive drives, but rather reveal a spiritual life force. So our personal unconscious can be studied through Jung's typology with the rational axis of thinking and feeling set against a perceptual axis of sensation and intuition, which is quite well known in Jungian psychology. Now, it's interesting how this axis forms a way to understand the conscious and unconscious, because the strongest and weakest of these four elements in our personal identity, that's thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition, respectively reveal our conscious and unconscious areas of emphasis. So we might be a person who's strong on thinking and less so on feeling, which comes through more in our unconscious. Jung explored how people have found durable meaning in the shared stories found in mythology. He defined myth as the stories that give us our sense of meaning, and critiqued the popular modern view that rejects myth as false belief. Myth is a product of the unconscious. It's a window on the soul. It serves to reveal life energies that are otherwise hidden. One theme Jung used to explore the relationship between ego and self, the parts of the self, is conscious and unconscious, is energy. In the psychic realms of human culture, energy manifests in myth, in story and symbol, in values and ethics. Psychic energy is a construction of the evolution of the mind. It's both deliberate and accidental, and is channeled through the symbols that connect the conscious and unconscious. Symbols participate in what they point to. They bridge the mind and the world to express a correspondence between the seen and the unseen. The energy of symbols is a key part of religious psychology, providing a sense of meaning that extends beyond our rational understanding to connect with a numinous mystery. In his 1912 book, Symbols of the Transformation, Jung defined symbols as images of content which transcend consciousness. This connection to the unknown that's provided by symbols, much more so than signs, a symbol is something that connects us to the unconscious. It opens a psychological path to interpret unconscious material that otherwise provides little trace of its existence. My own interpretation of Christian symbols, which I'll discuss tonight, aligned to Jung's analysis around the unconscious. And I'll look at it through how the symbols in the Bible contain abundant, essential information about visual astronomy, with archetypal material that's been repressed into the collective unconscious of humanity, and that I suggest has high explanatory power that's brought back into conscious awareness. In ancient times, there was a strong connection between religion and astronomy, seeing human existence against the visual framework of the cosmos. It's an aspect of modern culture that the loss of this connection that helps to explain Jung's concern about a loss of shared meaning and soul in our society. Jung contended that the description of symbols by skeptics can engage with this sense of mystery that we find in the religious traditions of divine revelation. Clift writes that in Jung's last book, Man and His Symbols, Jung said the role of religious symbols is to give meaning to our lives. And that means the living truth of psychic reality in myth has power through symbolic language. It connects the ultimate and infinite to the limited and finite in order to express eternal truth. This sense of connection is expressed in the Christian vision of Jesus Christ as the mediator between God and humanity, through the theology of the cross as a source of peace and reconciliation. Now, humans have evolved genetically to dominate our planet. We've also evolved culturally or mimetically through social and cultural memes that are embodied in our shared framework of meaning. And this is seen in both ancient and modern myths and symbols. Memes, as a word that didn't exist when Jung was writing, but I think helps to explain his ideas, are orderly structures of cultural meaning. They're both conscious and unconscious. They evolve in ways that are similar to natural selection, giving energy to the stories that provide our social cohesion, our direction, our values. The symbols and myths of religion evolve mimetically through causal evolutionary processes, precedent, cumulative adaptation, similar to genes. And the memes of our culture provide a major location of archetypal meaning. When we deliberately use energy, it's a function of our rational ego awareness. And sometimes the ego likes to imagine that that's all there is. But our lives are also determined by types of energy that are not seen by the conscious ego. unseen manifestations of energy. As I mentioned earlier, the libido, the shadow, appear in what Jung called the archetypes of the collective unconscious, in the symbols and stories of religion, most notably, that have historically provided a source of ultimate meaning. The irrational dimension in religion appears in beliefs and ritual practices that on the surface seem to make no sense. Yet the insight of depth psychology is its recognition of archetypal forms of energy that reveal our collective unconscious. They reveal the unseen order of our world that gives a durable shape to human identity, showing how symbols have hidden meaning. As I mentioned, my view is that a key to this hidden symbolic meaning in Christianity can be found through study of the cosmology of the Bible, primarily through the direct correspondence between the cosmic vision of the New Testament and visual observations of patterns in the stars that change over time. Restoring awareness of this cosmology, we can look to Jung as something of a guide. He offers a way to see the original intent of the gospel authors and opening psychological questions of how and why this material has been so thoroughly repressed into the unconscious and suppressed from view. Jung saw the decline of religion as resulting from two main factors: the failure of religion to value its symbolic meaning, and also the growing secular view that dogma is empty, that modern ethics can get by with no reference to religion. Jung looked to solve this loss of spiritual vitality through the construction of new forms of religion that could reconcile traditional faith with scientific reason. Now, this ambition made him a pariah in conventional religious and scientific circles, where such a reconciliation of faith and reason confronts some deeply held prejudices. His view was that the ideas that dominate our mainstream communities have major unconscious and therefore unseen assumptions. So these ideas function like myths. The intuitive shared beliefs that are expressed in myth make it hard for their adherents to enter dialogue with people who question them. People are captured by a mythological belief. Religious people often experience questioning of their own literal traditions of faith as an attack on their identity. And equally, Jung observed that scientific and scholarly communities often reject on principle this psychic construction of reality that Jung saw as the power and the grace of religion. His efforts to take a systematic logical approach to such deep questions of psychology mean Carl Jung can be considered among the greatest Christian theologians of recent centuries, despite, or perhaps because of, his deeply critical and ambivalent relationship to Christian faith. Looking at Christian origins in terms of psychic construction, Jung suggested in his answer to Job that Jesus Christ was an ordinary person with an extraordinary messianic calling. This calling led Christ to imagine his historical role against ancient prophecies of a saviour and deliberately to live out these prophecies to achieve what Jung calls an authentic and mature individuation, showing how to become a whole person. So this sense of Jesus Christ as the archetype of the self in Jung's thinking emerges in this idea of individuation. A key element in the prophecy in the Bible was the perfect innocence of the Saviour. For example, Isaiah 53 prophesies the suffering servant as the Messiah. In confrontation with the evil of the world, the pure innocence of Christ generated a durable psychic energy within the church through the archetypal myth of resurrection. Jung suggested that by intentionally constructing his life and values against a messianic framework, Christ created the opportunity for the church to build myths around him. The problem with these myths of Christendom was they came to protect institutions rather than understand the mystery of symbols. Applying the concepts of psychology to explain the gospel story offers a path toward a recognition of its ethical meaning, looking beyond the literal traditions of the church to explore the psychic content of the myths as symbolic bridges to the unconscious. At the same time, applying psychology to understand the church can see how church theology often involves unconscious projection and distortion. For example, the projection of God as father by analogy to the paternal role of human fathers. A comforting reading of scripture can construct an emotionally satisfying fantasy for its believers, but it represses content that challenges the accepted story. This whole process builds up problems in what Jung called the unconscious shadow, a shadow that's produced by the distortions and errors in conscious belief. Gender types, the anima and animus, the female and male, are a major area of the psychological shadow in religion. The conscious exclusion of the feminine in religion produced an unconscious compensation for the sake of psychological equilibrium. And Jung discusses this quite extensively in the Catholic adoration of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Bringing such unconscious factors into consideration can help to analyse the psychology of religious belief. It offers a constructive path to both respect the received story while also asking what the religious message might really mean in terms of symbolic power and in a context of psychotherapy. Recognition of the major role of unconscious factors in the construction of our shared beliefs is an essential insight that Jung brought into psychology. This analysis is not welcomed by those who promulgate myths. And that, I think, helps to explain why churches tend to find such discussion quite difficult. And the question of what were the actual historical events that gave rise to the New Testament is a primary example of this problem. Now, in some ways, it would have been a miracle if Jesus really lived, because there's many aspects of the story that are quite difficult to explain. And the evidence for the historical Jesus all goes back to the Gospel of Mark. It's a single literary source whose purpose was to record a sacred allegory. And then the stories about Jesus in later texts built upon Mark's original story. The epistles of Paul were written well before the Gospel of Mark, and they don't have any dependence on the Gospels, which is quite strange. The Gospels were written later. Now, if we look for a plausible explanation of how the story evolved, one hypothesis is there was an earlier belief in a cosmic Christ, and this belief was gradually brought down to earth in the story of Jesus of Nazareth. It's a bit like flesh added to dry bones described by prophet Ezekiel. The mythological roots of the Jesus story begin with the Old Testament, and they extend both consciously and unconsciously across the whole region of the earth from India to Greece, including Babylon, Egypt, Assyria. Buddhist roots of Christianity are particularly interesting. There was a Buddhist monastery on Lake Mareotis in Egypt, which was home to the Therapeut community that is thought by many to have produced Mark's Gospel. There's some key factors that show this Buddhist influence that's not well known. There's a strong moral similarity between Buddhist teachings and the Gospel. And monasticism existed in India for centuries before it emerged in the Mediterranean region with Christian monasticism. It's interesting to suggest that Christian rejection of this Indian influence reflects unconscious historical prejudices within the psychology of European dominance that was built upon the Christendom model of church and state. And so it's very interesting to see how Carl Jung really valued the Indian heritage and sought in a context of comparative religion to understand how it relates to Christianity. Now, the Christian ego, understood as the form of thinking in the dominant church, is affronted by its shadow, which can be seen in the eyes of victims of empire. Allowing Buddhism into a historical conversation about Christian origins could have high therapeutic value in this context, expanding the horizon that we apply to understand Christian origins. One interesting image in the Bible in this context is the angels with flaming swords that stand outside the Garden of Eden to prevent Adam and Eve from returning. My interpretation of that story is that they symbolize a barrier between East and West, and they reflect a really distinct fallen state of the West. This biblical myth of the fall from divine grace points to a scale of delusion in Western thinking. The problem is that when we take these stories literally, we fail to see their symbolic meaning. In fundamentalist religion, this syndrome appears to go beyond the neurotic and cling to fantasy stories. In Buddhism, the core teaching is that delusion is the cause of suffering. And I think Jung's work showed that teaching has much to offer in the psychoanalysis of Christianity. Delusion arises when we block material from conscious awareness. We consign significant facts to the unconscious, and we construct an imaginative rationalization of our situation. Identifying these blockages can open up paths to enable our rational consciousness to better integrate with our unconscious self in an understanding of the whole. This vision of the integration of the soul appears as a theme in the story of Christ. There's abundant unconscious symbolism within Christianity. For example, Jesus serves as a personification of the sun, the star, providing light and life and order to the world. Placing this cosmic vision of the sun into human myth has a strong continuity with earlier sun worship mythologies, while bringing the innovation of putting the saviour figure in the historical context of the Roman Empire. From Jung's analysis of who Christ really was, we could imagine that Jesus was a person who projected his own identity upon the messianic traditions of the world and shared this as an imaginative literary vision with Mark. And the story was framed around the guiding question of what a Messiah would have been like if he had existed. The view of the perfect man described by Mark and the evangelists reflects a social need to imagine a world saviour, connecting, redeeming our fallen state through an allegory of divine grace. The French philosopher Voltaire said that if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. And this same necessity applies to the social and psychological function of the story of Jesus in Christianity, that if he hadn't lived, it would have been necessary to invent him, enabling a shared interpretation of history through the vision of a world saviour. Rather than seeing this sort of commentary as a critique of the Gospels, my view is that it can instead be used to unlock the hidden meaning that the church has relegated to the collective unconscious. The suppression of heresy over the long period of Christendom created social conditions in which open discussion of the allegorical meaning in the Gospels wasn't possible. If we try to escape from this intimidating context of an insistence on orthodoxy in theology, we can now read the Gospels as a sublime literary fiction, whose premise is that the events described actually occurred in history. And this opens up a vista of interpretation of how the collective unconscious has influenced religious psychology. The theme of incarnation is one example of looking at what it means to say God is present on earth. Popular faith sees this as far better explained by the actual incarnation of God in Christ than an imaginary one. And it creates a strong drive to believe that the imaginary events actually happened. It's like Anselm, bishop, was a notable early theologian, and his proof of the existence of God was that a real God is better than an imaginary one and therefore must really exist. Now, it's a claim that doesn't make any logical sense, but it's powerful psychological and emotional comfort serves to justify our social structures. So by believing these stories are actually true, they serve social cohesion. The ethical power of Jesus Christ as a symbol of the triumph of good over evil remains just as vital and valid whether the gospel story is historical or allegorical. However, the claim that Jesus was historical lent itself far more easily to mobilizing a mass movement. Growth of the church required a simple shared story. That was something far more easily achieved by treating the Gospels as history than through the complex psychology of symbol and myth of the type that Jung presents. When Christianity became the Roman state religion, the literal belief was enforced to support imperial security and stability. And then the Christendom millennium for the next 1,000 years after the fall of Rome made this assumption of gospel truth unquestionable. And any doubts about the literal story were relegated to the collective unconscious. The Christian creed has emphasized gospel truth as its paradigm of reliable fact. And that creates an immediate contrast between Christian stories and the normal standards of historical inquiry. And a number of serious scholars are now open to the suggestion that the Jesus of the Gospels was a fictional character. It's an idea that continues to be widely despised and rejected, but it presents a paradigm shift that could resolve many anomalies in conventional faith, while opening a path to a new shared sense of the holy in a numinous encounter with God. When we insist on the historical existence of Jesus, we stand within an imperial political tradition. The dogma of gospel truth was used to support social cohesion in Christian nations and empires. So the scientific method of radical doubt applied to the Bible needs to look below the surface of faith to explore its unconscious motives. Now, I'm going to go on to this theme of astronomy in biblical systems. I'll just go to the next slide. You might know this. It's the the Chi-Rho cross. I'll explain it a bit more. Jung argued that a major unconscious motivation for Christian faith can be seen in an exact correspondence observed in the ancient world between Christian cosmology and astronomy through a observation known as the Procession of the Equinox. What happened was there was a new zodiac age dawned at the time of Christ as the equinox point moved into the constellation of Pisces. The position of the sun at the equinox shifted from the constellation of Aries into Pisces at that time in a very slow cycle around the stars. And it's remained in Pisces for the last 2,000 years. My interest is to explore how the symbolism of this observable shift of the stars found its way into the theories of time in the New Testament. There was an intimate connection in the ancient world between astronomy and religion, dating from well before the rise of writing. Communities used observation of the sun and the stars to govern their calendar and the timing of religious rituals. The connection of religion to astronomy was largely severed by Christianity and was then abandoned by modern science. But this idea that precession of the equinox influenced the original Christian cosmology suggests a blueprint in the stars for the Christian story. Jung emphasized the centrality of procession to the role of Christ as the fisher of men, seeing Christ as the avatar of the zodiac age of Pisces, the fish. This analysis can be extended to numerous biblical symbols, such as the miracle of the loaves and fishes, the Alpha and Omega, the allegorical language of the New Jerusalem in the Apocalypse. It's a line of analysis supported by the observation that the early church had both a secret and a public teaching, with the argument that when the public teaching won out in the church, it sought to eliminate the secret mystery ideas that gave it birth. But these original ideas didn't simply disappear entirely. They remained in place in the collective unconscious through the symbols and texts that were based on them. We can now seek to bring these unconscious influences into conscious awareness. One Christian symbol that appears to have a powerful unconscious astronomical meaning is the Chi-Rho cross. The X, or Chi, matches to the great circles formed by the celestial equator and the path of the sun at the equinox, observable in ancient astronomy. While the P figure, actually the rho, matches to the line of stars known as the first fish of Pisces. We'll move on to the next picture. Now, this is a picture of the stars around the equinox point in the center, where the path of the sun crosses the celestial equator. And we can see Aries, the ram, has his hoof pointed to the exact spot where the path of the sun moves across the first line of stars of Pisces. You can see the two fish there that form the constellation Pisces. The X was described by Plato as what he called the moving image of eternity. And it crossed this line of stars at the time of Christ, as shown in these diagrams. Yeah, that's good. Modern astronomy calculates that this event, because what's happening here is that the path of the sun is always the same. It always goes through the same stars, but the white line across the celestial equator, it moves around the whole sphere over 20,000 years. So it's a very slow movement, but it meant that the question was, is it possible that this Chi-Rho cross figure with the Alpha and Omega signifying the beginning and the end was based on this observation of this X and in the stars crossing another line? So modern astronomy calculates this event occurred on 15th of September in 21 AD, and the direct correlation connects an astronomical observation that could readily have been understood for centuries before the time of Christ, together with the meaning of the Christian story as bringing a new covenant of love and grace. There are some Russian icons that I can show you next, which of the resurrection, which use this Easter symbol of the Chi-Rho cross. So we have each of the Christ figures standing upon the X at Easter to symbolize resurrection, in a similar way to how the movement of the equinox point out of the constellation of Aries into the constellation of Pisces symbolized a new age. The letters Alpha and Omega are the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. And they symbolize, in this context, the beginning and end of time. And the conventional church has understood this in a very ungrounded way, Whereas if you put it into this context of ancient observation of the stars, it matches directly to this observable movement of the equinox out of Aries, the first sign of the zodiac, and into Pisces, which is the last sign. So on this model, the incarnation of Christ symbolizes a visible shift of zodiac ages. It's a stable and eternal cycle of time. If this was the original meaning of the Chi-Rho symbol, and I don't know of any objective evidence that it is, so it's quite a speculative suggestion on my part, its loss from awareness can perhaps be explained by the tension it has against the literal story of the gospel. The view that Jesus only seemed to be incarnate was condemned in the church as heresy, the heresy of Docetism. For 1,000 years, the church sought to destroy any writings that supported this view. Yet, if this type of astronomy was actually central to the original construction of Christianity, its suppression into the collective unconscious is something that can be studied by analysis of the traces that that original process left in symbols such as the Chi-Rho cross, which has a direct and exact match to that astronomical idea. I'll move on to talk about how orbital cycles provide a structure of the collective unconscious. And we'll go to, this is a diagram of, as I'll explain, it describes the structure of time for our planet. So this biblical analysis I've been talking about, it suggests that natural cycles of time could be central to the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Now, we can see this quite readily in the cycles of the day and the week and the month and the year. For example, our blood chemistry changes with the daily cycle of activity and rest. And it affects our conscious awareness in ways of which we're completely unconscious. Ocean tides follow a weekly pattern driven by the orbit of the moon, which of course also creates the monthly cycle of light and dark in the night. The annual cycle of the seasons follows this same pattern of activity and rest. Activity in spring and summer and rest in autumn and winter. The slow cycle of precession of the equinox causes natural climate change with the cycle of ice ages. The ice ages advance and retreat over about 20,000 years. Now, the suggestion that this slow cycle could have unconscious effects on biological evolution can be analysed by looking for traces of this process, setting mythology against the orbital cycle of light and dark. The astronomer Milankovitch showed that the key marker of the orbital climate cycle is the amount of sunlight at the summer solstice in the northern temperate latitudes. So we see in this diagram that when sunlight on the summer solstice is high, then we have a warmer period, and when the sunlight is low, we have a cooler period. And this graph could be extended back into the past to show a very close correlation between the up and down of summer sunlight at that latitude and the advance and retreat of ice ages. And so setting this against history, we see in this diagram that this measure reached a low point over the last 2,000 years, shown there as the present, falling from a high point at the dawn of the Holocene about 10,000 years ago, before that rising from a low point at the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago. It's a cycle that's largely defined by orbital factors, especially the date each year when the Earth is closest to the sun, known as the perihelion. And every year that's now about the 3rd of January, and it advances by 1 day every 58 years. In 10,000 years, the perihelion will be at the June solstice. So we can see this pattern of that creates the ice ages in this diagram. There's, interestingly, a mythological cycle that quite exactly matches this orbital pattern. It's the Vedic myth of the Yuga, which described a cycle of light and dark over 24,000 years and extended in its popular form to billions of years. On this model, so here we are, this is a way of setting the Yuga cycle of Vedic myth against this empirical astronomical time frame of climate change, natural climate change. On this model, the Earth is now emerging from the Kali Yuga, which is the Iron Age of darkness and ignorance, and over the next 12,000 years, moving into a new golden age, which is the Satya Yuga of light and wisdom. Setting Christianity against this model of time can see Jesus Christ as representing the spirit of the golden age in the midst of the Iron Age, which helps to explain the Christian theme of resurrection. The Iron Age is symbolized by the zodiac age of Pisces occurring at the same time as the zodiac age of Pisces. And in this model, the second coming of Jesus Christ represents an upward movement towards light and wisdom, a change of the collective unconscious, symbolized by the dawning of the zodiac age of Aquarius. And on the next slide, I've overlaid the Yuga cycle onto the precession wave to show how they correlate. That is, black represent the Iron Ages and yellow represent the Golden Ages, ascending bronze and silver. So there's this basic correlation between this cosmology. And seeing this orbital structure as providing an unconscious governing pattern for consciousness means we can interpret the last 10,000 years as a period of growing separation of human culture from our cosmic context. In Christianity, this produced the myth of the fall from grace, and the coming 10,000 years as a period of gradual reintegration into spiritual wholeness, despite it being extremely slow against historical timescales. This model offers a way to create some hope about the development of a stable human existence on our planet. It also suggests we're at a turning point, with the old paradigm of descent that operated over the last 10,000 years still dominating our culture, while a new paradigm of ascent seeks to break through into consciousness. Seen against the archetypes of the collective unconscious, we can interpret the Christian myth of crucifixion against the motif of cosmic descent, and the myth of resurrection against the motif of ascent. The rising and falling cycle of light over the precession period shown here is now just past its low point. It's equivalent to the annual winter at 3 January in the Northern Hemisphere, 2 weeks after the solstice. This precession cycle can be defined in terms of 4 cosmic seasons, like the 4 annual seasons. These cosmic climate seasons are defined by the date when the Earth is closest to the sun. And 10,000 years ago, that was in northern summer, and now it's in northern winter. The perihelion crossed the December solstice 8 centuries ago in 1246 AD. There's a direct correlation between the cosmic season of fall and the period imagined in Christianity as the fall from grace into corruption, described in the Bible. My view is that this correlation reflects an unconscious forcing of cultural trends in a rising and falling millennial trajectory with these orbital drivers. Humanity is part of this natural planetary cycle, and this cycle is reflected in our mythological imagination. By grounding the collective unconscious in astronomy in this way, we can seek to put Jung's analysis of archetypes into a more empirical framework. I'd like to draw this together a bit with our world situation today by examining some unconscious influences upon our understanding of climate change, which is the greatest security peril for our planet. Now, the science of climate change is very clear, but it seems to me that unconscious factors prevent dialogue about what we should do about climate change. We have the mainstream policy of cutting emissions by decarbonising the economy. And the strange thing about that is that it will do absolutely nothing to prevent extreme weather in this decade, for several decades yet. It's too small, it's too slow. The only solution, in my view, is to shift into a new planetary paradigm through measures to cool the planet directly. So an example is we can brighten the clouds in the Southern Ocean as a global initiative to mitigate the dangers of warming. Brighter clouds would create a cooling shield for Antarctica, would freeze the sea ice and slow glacial ice loss, and increase the regional reflection of sunlight back to space. That would protect biodiversity and cool the ocean currents that are a main contribution to extreme weather. Now, you might not have heard of this sort of thinking, and a reason why is that there's a strong psychological blockage against it within climate policy. So, for example, marine cloud brightening was quite deliberately excluded from discussion in the International Panel on Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it seems that the reason why is that it conflicts with our dominant narrative around the priority of cutting emissions, decarbonising the economy. I wonder if this sense of a psychological blockage that's stopping a conversation about what we can actually do to fix climate change could be analysed in terms of the collective unconscious. You know, are there patterns in the unconscious that give rise to the lack of engagement around these sorts of questions? So scientific knowledge has a strong alignment to progressive politics. And it appears that this alignment has created a polarization. And so we all know that the climate policy advocates say the main thing to do is to rapidly shift away from fossil fuels. There's a basic problem though with doing that, and that's that it would only prevent a tiny, tiny fraction of warming. And if we want to keep the planet stable and livable, keep sea level rise down, instead we need to implement these direct cooling measures. But they're very difficult to open up a conversation about. So if we think that closing fossil fuel industries is the only climate agenda, we're following in a political model that's based on the old idea that we need a popular front of progressive forces to achieve any progressive change. And that is a socially polarizing view. And the problem is ending emissions is nowhere near enough to stop climate change. Against the primary role of the cause of climate change is committed warming from past emissions. And to explain that, since human industry began, we've added about 1 trillion tonnes of carbon to the atmosphere. And each year we add to that by 15 gigatons, which is about 1.5% of the whole problem. And so the big problem is we've got committed warming from past emissions, but people can't imagine anything that we could do about that. And so the whole problem is about 60 times bigger than our annual emissions. So I would like to see us focus on how we can convert this large stock of carbon into useful forms as a climate agenda and work to brighten the planet to prevent extreme weather and sea level rise and stabilizing the climate. So going back to how this connects to Jung, he showed that it's entirely possible to detect unconscious influences upon our life. And this idea of unconscious influences, it remains very controversial for the simple reason that if it's unconscious, it's outside our conscious awareness. In politics and religion, we see that unconscious factors are at work, as I've tried to illustrate tonight. And in our personal lives, unconscious factors can help to explain our motives, our beliefs, and think about how some of the worthy goals that we have can actually be achieved. Thanks, I'll end there. Now, I must say, it's pretty dense material, and so I'm sorry if there were areas that people found hard to follow, and I'd really welcome conversation about it. Jean.
Thank you, Robbie. You've given us a lot to think about. I think we're going to be thinking about all the things that you've come up with tonight. So we might be able to relieve ourselves by coming over and having supper and having a cup of tea and having a nice drink out there, if you like. And also, we've got some new people here. If you'd like to go around and introduce yourselves to each other, I will come around and help you with that, because it's lovely to see such new people coming in to the Jung Society, because having new people coming strengthening us as a group. We're not going to dwindle. So we want like new blood, new people coming in, and you're very welcome to contribute in any way, shape, or whatever you want to do. You can just talk to us and see how you can contribute to make this a very good society, because we want everyone from different cultures and different walks of life to come in and make it a great group of people to be around. So I'd like to invite everyone to come over. You can have a look at the books if you like. If you're a member, you can borrow the books. And we've got new books that have come into the shelf. It's a bit higgly-piggly there at the moment, so we have to do a workshop on it, I think, because of the new books. Ross White, our friend who was a Jungian, who was a president, he died a little while ago, and he's given us a lot of books. That's why I was just throwing it over there in a group of new books that have come in. So we'll, if you're interested and if you're a member, you can borrow the books, okay? So you can come over and just mingle and just have a drink. The drinks are in here in the kitchen, and the supper is at the back. And the books are over there for $25 over there. You can see Francis, okay. Oh, okay, we're about 15 minutes. Is that okay? Yeah, all right. So we can move around, talk to our friends. We've got new people. Say back to how you've been. And you can have a look at books afterwards if you like. So you can have your cup of tea or something to eat in your hands, that's fine. So with the books, if you like to borrow books, you probably need to be a member. Oh, you're a member now. Oh, well done. Congratulations. So what's your name? Vincent. Well, welcome. Welcome to the Jung Society. We like it. If you'd like to come and sit down, everybody coming, sitting down, please, because Robbie would like to get started. Excuse me. Let's come and bring your goodies and a cup of tea. Sitting down, please. Thank you. I can talk, my voice can go right through a hall. And one of the kids was saying to me, he says, James, you have such a loud voice. I said, well, that's all the better for you to hear, dear. Yeah. I've been around teaching for too long. 50 years I've been out there. But now I have the pleasure of working with different people now in the Jung Society. So I'm very privileged. So it's very nice to have your people coming along tonight and to have lovely Robbie here with us. That's also special because Robbie's been out on a big safari trip up through Queensland and all around the place, dodging the floods. So here he is. We're very lucky. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Jane. So just happy to take comments and questions. Richard.
I have a question. It was very, very fascinating talk. Thank you. But I have no idea what marine cloud brightening is.
Yeah, sure. So the issue is that salt, when it gets out of the ocean into the clouds, it makes the clouds brighter because each crystal of salt will attract water to it. And then when the water droplet has got a salt molecule or a salt crystal at its center, then it will reflect a whole lot more sunlight. So the question is, how do we get the salt convert it into fog above the ocean, which will then rise up into the clouds? Now, my view is that if we did marine cloud brightening in this way in the Southern Ocean, then it would make the whole ocean around Antarctica reflect a lot more sunlight. It would become brighter, and that would cool down with many valuable effects. Now, I know Shauna was coming to the defense of the of people who view this idea with scorn, but I put it to you that those people have absolutely no suggestion about doing anything that will mitigate extreme weather in this decade. So we've seen the atmospheric river that's just hit Lismore. If we cooled down the Southern Ocean by increasing the planetary albedo, then that would cool down the currents that are coming out of Antarctica and help to reduce the damage from climate change. You put ships, specially designed ships, out into the ocean, which would suck up salt water and put it through a nozzle, which turns it into mist. And then it would naturally rise up into the clouds. Thanks, Richard. It's very cheap. It's very cheap, it's very safe, it's very simple, but it suffers from extreme prejudice. So the advocates of it have been excluded from all climate talks. And the reason that they're excluded is because people say the main thing is to shut down the fossil fuel industry, and this just gives a lifeline to the fossil fuel industry. So it's an interesting debate. You know, do we actually need to cut our emissions to stabilize the climate? That's a heresy in climate circles, but it may be that the main thing we need to do is first brighten the planet, then remove carbon dioxide from the air at a much larger scale than our emissions, and continue to emit. So that it's another model which is just so politically difficult for people to engage with that there's just not really much conversation about it. Yeah. Well, that's what I was saying about the polarization in this field, because, and I think that a lot of that polarization rests on unconscious assumptions. And that's where I find it quite relevant to the whole psychological question of, you know, what, look, these issues, the physics of it is quite complicated, but I would say that, you know, stopping the Arctic from melting is just one of the most urgent things, because if the Arctic melts, Greenland has got about 7 meters of sea level rise stored up in the ice on it. Antarctica has got 80 meters of sea level rise. So if you think of if Greenland melted, and it could happen quite suddenly through unknown tipping points. Beg your pardon? Okay. Well, not to the extent, not at the speed that we're currently changing things. So if you look back to the diagram that I showed of the, okay, I'll put it up again. Thank you, Jeff. The period between the last glacial maximum and the dawn of the Holocene, this one, sea level rose 125 meters. So at the last glacial maximum, sea level was 125 meters below. So there were vast areas of continental shelf that are currently ocean, which previously through the Ice Age were where people lived. And then you had the flood. Over the next 10,000 years, at some times it was rising by a meter per century. And all of those coastal areas were flooded. So then we have a series of myths that, like, so we have the myth of the flood, of course. And if you can point to a story like this that shows, hey, actually there was this gigantic disruption of our life on Earth, because people mainly lived by the sea, and then the sea rose by 125 meters, and all of that culture was disrupted. Well, that's the thing, that the meaning of the myth is not the literal story. It's not a claim this actually happened in history. It's what's the archetypal symbolic meaning that's being discussed here. And we can take the example of the flood. We can take the example of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And, you know, there are many people who will say, well, that's not possible. So the whole of Christianity is ridiculous. But if we instead say the resurrection has a powerful symbolic meaning, and explore that symbolic meaning, for example, by analogy with the role of the sun through the seasons, then it can start to have more of a real meaning against a scientific worldview.
And then is there a kind of cyclic nature where myth becomes, the awareness or appreciation of myth becomes kind of unconscious throughout different periods in history, and then it arises again where we become a more mythological based society, or we recognize the myths that we live out more consciously as a kind of remedy to the, I guess, the lack of individualization of humanity, in a sense, in different ages, like the Yugas and that sort of thing. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, when you talk about cycles, so I'm talking about cycles that are 20,000 years in duration. And so we don't have data that explains, for example, so humans moved from Africa to India about 80,000 years ago, and then lived through 3 cycles in India where the ocean rose and fell, and the glaciers in the Himalayas advanced and retreated. Now, we don't have any evidence that that long experience over tens of thousands of years was the basis for the Yuga framework, but there's an exact correlation between the two. So the experience that people had in India. As to this question of cycles of mythology on a shorter time frame, it's I suppose I don't see it so much as cyclic on a shorter time frame, because we haven't really had the cycles. You know, what happens is we've got invasions, and the myths of the new dominant state subordinate the myths of the old inhabitants. And then, like, I think that's something that we're seeing in Australia, that when the British invaded Australia, they basically said that Aboriginal mythology was totally meaningless, and sought to completely replace it by the conventional Christian mythology. And what's happening now is that ideology is seen as quite hollow, and there's a new respect emerging for Indigenous identity and culture. And so there's a return of Indigenous ideas within, and that's something that operates at both an unconscious and conscious level.
Does look different? 60 degrees south? Would it flip, or I see the reason that it is the north, but...
The reason that it's the north is because when the astronomers looked at comparing all of the latitudes of the Earth based on how much sunlight comes in due to these orbital changes, they found that there was a direct correlation between this pattern at 60 degrees north and the Ice Age cycle. So when this line goes up, you get warming, planetary warming. And the reason for that is that there's so much more land in the Northern Hemisphere. So about 60 degrees north is about where there's most land. And so Antarctica is like a refrigerator for the planet. You know, it's surrounded by the Southern Ocean. It's quite stable in its structure, whereas the Arctic is just very open to sensitive influence from. So this tiny orbital effect, you know, just a little change of watts per square meter in sunlight coming in the summer versus the winter, that was enough that when the insolation was low, what happened was that the snow that fell in winter stuck around and it didn't melt in the summer. And then more snow fell next year and the glaciers expanded. So it was the northern glaciers expanded that affected the whole planetary cycle. I mean, that's the sort of mainstream scientific understanding. But what it really illustrates is how incredibly sensitive our planet is to these very subtle orbital effects. And the interesting thing that comes out of that is that this whole connection of this up and down line, I should have extended it back into the past, but it's been totally destroyed by anthropogenic climate change. So the amount of change that we're causing to the watts per square meter is so much bigger than this natural change that we're not going to have new ice ages in the future unless we deliberately create them certainly for many tens of thousands of years. Like we've put so much warming into the system that it's likely that so we've currently put enough warming into the system for the sea to rise by 10 or 20 meters. And that may take a few hundred years, it may take a few decades, we really don't know. So, I mean, security-wise in climate change, we're in a real mess because we're not doing anything to stop sea level rise. And that's why I'm so interested in these direct methods.
So, Robbie, you're saying in effect that tipping point has already been reached. And simply changing our light bulbs and so forth and reducing fossil fuels will no longer be as you say, not anything like sufficient.
The issue is the cause of climate forcing is the trillion tonnes of carbon that we will have added to the climate system by the end of this century. And against that, the ratio is 1,000 gigatons that we've added, that's a trillion, versus 15 that we're adding each year. Now, if we work really hard on cutting our emissions, so we're currently emitting about 15 gigatons of carbon, which you multiply it by about 3 to get carbon dioxide. And if we worked really hard on cutting our emissions, then we might get down to, say, 10. So say we've currently got 1,000 in the atmosphere. We're going to keep adding to it by 10 every year. We're going to keep destabilizing the system. And so we just need a completely different way of thinking about it. Just cutting emissions is really quite marginal to solving the climate problem.
Plant trees, growing seaweed.
Yeah. Well, these things need to be scaled up to the gigaton level, and that's what people have found difficult to work out how to do. But it's something that's very possible if there was the political will. And also oil and gas exploration. So that's why I take the view that starting with the Southern Ocean is likely to be a more feasible approach, because there's more of an international framework for agreement in the Southern Ocean, and it's a long way away from hotspots like Ukraine. So, yeah, so it's something I'd like to see discussed more. Richard.
Move away from climate. I think it's very interesting. Whether or not the degree to which Jesus is historical in mythology of Jesus. But we tend to see it, I think, with kind of blind with, whether one is Christian or not, whether it's culture. And there's a forgetting that Jesus is so important as well. There's a mythology of Jesus in this life. It doesn't involve resurrection. But rather Jesus as a prophet.
What we see in early Christianity is that from about the 2nd century, the church absolutely insisted on Jesus being real, because there were a lot of people around who were saying he wasn't real. There were a lot of people around who were saying that Jesus was imaginary. And so what then happened was that it was then 4 or 5 centuries before the rise of Islam. And over those centuries, the Christian church said, if you disagree with us, we will kill you. And so that provided a really strong incentive for people to throw away any books that disagreed with the Orthodox dogma. And so many people were killed. We know, you might know the story that Jung was involved with from the Nag Hammadi Gnostic Gospels, where these books, such as the Gospel of Thomas and others, were found buried in pottery jars in the desert sand in the most far southern part of Egypt, which appears to indicate that those documents, which had been quite popular in their time, had been totally obliterated from everywhere else, except where somebody used such elaborate means to conceal them. So if that material was so comprehensively lost, just think how much more was lost. Like I think of it as analogous to if there's a rich primeval forest and somebody comes along and bulldozes it, and then you come back in 5 years and maybe there's a sort of trace of the forest, but you can't really tell. And it's like that, I think, with early Christianity. I think that the culture around the formation of the Gospels was vastly richer than the imperial tradition that we've received through Christendom, because they said we're using this dogma as a basis for political security and stability. So we need to have one single agreed truth, and anyone who disagrees will kill. And that was the policy for 1,000 years. So the loss of it means we have to go back to what I was calling the fugitive traces, and seeing that there are clues in the Bible. Now, I mentioned the Cairo cross as one example. There are many other texts in the Bible that indicate that Procession of the Equinox provided the blueprint for the Jesus myth. And so if that's a possible story, it's something that deserves to be explored in much more detail rather than just rejected out of hand.
How do you see the other end of that, where Catholicism breaks into Anglicanism and Protestantism and Catholicism, and then other religions, other denominations sort of multiply after that point again?
Jung has a lot to say about the Protestant Reformation, and he was in a way, despite coming out of a Protestant background, he had enormous sympathy for the Catholic tradition because of its sense of mystery, which he felt was lost in the Protestant focus on rational explanation. And I think it's really interesting to read theology against a sort of hermeneutic of looking for signs of the collective unconscious in it. And I think that that's quite a productive way to understand what's driving people to hold these beliefs. And we can, so I mean, one example is just the role. Okay, so you've still got me talking. I can hear myself talking. I'll just let Robert turn his copy off. So the role of religion and family is an interesting case where churches provide a framework to encourage fertility, and that has a sort of unconscious effect on why is it that churches survive despite holding beliefs which are manifestly untrue, because they can generate a sort of social cohesion and direction.
Robbie, in terms of historicity, I rather like the story about Yuri Gagarin touring Indonesia in probably about 1968, and very popular, of course, at that time in Indonesian, Russian history, a big crowd and everything. And one of his comments, of course, was,
he was the first man in space.
Sorry, you and I are old enough to remember that. Yes, and he was quite proud to make the point that he said, I was up there in the stars and the earth just circle underneath me and so forth, and I didn't see any sign of God or the angels at all, and that sort of proves that there's nothing there. One of the smart Alex from the audience yelled out, Colonel, I'm sure that if you just opened your hatch, you would have met your maker very smartly.
It's an interesting story because like what we see there is the role of communist atheism as the ideology of the Soviet Union, which Gagarin represented. And so some sense of obligation on his part to defend the atheist ideology. And it's so contrasted with what people like Buzz Aldrin said, that when they looked at our planet from space, it was a sublime spiritual moment for them. They suddenly realized a new sense of reality and finite fragility of our planet. And so those astronomers who came back were profoundly changed in a spiritual way. Well, of course, the photographs of the world from space. I should have put one up because I've got a great photo of the world from Antarctica, and so helping to imagine what it would be like to brighten the clouds around Antarctica. It's the thing is, it's the fragility, the sensitivity of our planet is something that what we need to do is understand it as a whole. And that's not just understanding our planet as a whole, it's also understanding that our solar system is where we live. Like, so for example, if our solar system out to Neptune was like that, then the next star would be more than 100 meters away. So we live in the solar system, you know, we're flotsam of the sun. You know, the sun has got 499 500ths of all the mass in the solar system. You know, where our planet is just tiny. It's so interesting to look at our existence against real cosmic scales and just understand the risks. And one of the things about the sensitivity is that climate change is like an absolute wrecking ball. You know, we are changing the system so fast that we're likely to have unforeseen tipping points, as we've seen with our current floods.
It does really seem like the species is trying to be here in 100, you know, or very, at least the numbers will be reduced, you know, like to an incredible degree, and we will lose civilization. I mean, that's my sense is that we're not going to act. The consequences are going to be, you know, huge catastrophes with the environment and also war, problems with the environment, food, and, you know, water. And I kind of see the species as being, you know, more or less wiped out, apart from a few roaming bands of, you know, people that are. But
that sort of apocalyptic cynicism, it comes from people who reject the idea that we can actually do something about it by geoengineering. So if we said can make a concerted effort to protect the planet for our future, then we would be able to stabilize sea level. We would be able to prevent catastrophic collapse.
And I know we've discussed this, and I haven't looked into it, but I have spoken to someone who is a scientist working for the government who says that geoengineering stuff is not.
And that's the mainstream view within the International Panel on Climate Change, but there's a really growing body of dissent from that mainstream view.
And as I said, that we covered that before, so that, you know, that was where my understanding is. When you say I have this apocalyptic outlook, you know, it comes from thinking, you know, and then you say, believe there can be that geoengineering. I said, well, that was my approach to what I've heard of geoengineering, and also the apocalyptic outlook is from the sense that we are not going to act. We're not acting, and I really, you know, I have relatives who are having babies, you know, and I mean, they're having babies, you know, and I'm thinking, I just would not want to be having a baby, you know, because it scares me what the future holds. But
so relating it to this chart, as I said, what it indicates to me is that our cultural trajectory, if we do explore this hypothesis that there's a link between our cultural trajectory and this long-term climate trajectory, then our cultural trajectory for the last 10,000 years until about 1,000 years ago was straight downward, and the cultural trajectory for the next 10,000 years is upward. So it's like, what's the scale of the paradigm shift that's required to get our culture to move away from a destructive, alienated mentality that fails to engage with nature to one that seeks to create a sustainable home for us on our planet.
And that's what I don't see 10,000. I really see, or like I said, small bands roaming around sustainably,
So it's like we're at this threshold, which I think was raised in terms of the Fermi paradox.
Like what we've got 7 billion people, 7.5 billion people, and living the way we do. It's not sustainable. And those of us who are consuming too much and not going to give up our lifestyle, So those of us who are privileged in the world and who are doing the most consuming, we're going to have to be wiped out.
Well, that it's a widely held view that you're describing, but I suppose the way I look at it is to say we are headed for significant conflict, but it's possible to construct a vision of how we can get through that conflict, how we can understand it scientifically, its causes, its effects, and develop a path to sustain human life on our planet. And I think it was the Fermi paradox, which was that intelligence is inherently self-destructive, that when you get a planet to a level of sophistication of having technology, then it destroys itself. And so the question is, can we be aware of that problem and find a solution to it? And it's a very big challenge, but I think we have to put that challenge up.
And psychologically, I think that will then decrease the ability to think positive. So because my youngest brother was sending in a poem, which is all sort of depressive, 3 of them, and I wrote to him, there is a choice between seeing a problem, perhaps doing something about it, and remaining positive that you can. Because if you say you can't, then that's it, finish.
No, as humans, we've evolved to notice threats like the rustle in the bush now. But the complex threats that face us at the moment, we're not very good at processing it. And we also have a planet that is, there's a small elite who are very greedy, who seem to have a lot of power, a lot more power than the rest of us. And, there is, I don't live my life being depressed, I get on with it, but I'm just saying my overall picture is pretty grim.
I think it's got something to say. Satisfaction or some, you can feel better if you like, because of just what Robbie was saying, that we know that the Earth is only a very tiny place, and we know more and more there are more and more planets in the universe that have been seen. So therefore, there must be many civilizations that have come across this kind of challenge. And probably many of them
don't even know that we haven't found any evidence of extraterrestrial.
We haven't found any, but our logic will tell us that there are.
There should be, yes.
Yeah, and we would say probably other civilizations have also faced this kind of challenge and overcome it.
I think the scientists will say there could be, and the theologians might say there should be, or I might say there should not.
But Shawnee, your point raises for me a really interesting question, which goes again to what was the purpose of Christianity in its origins. And one of the things is that earlier religions had emphasized that you should love your friends and hate your enemies, that you should be tribal in your morality, that you should instinctively support your own clan and oppose people outside your clan. But when Christianity came along at the dawn of the Common Era, which was formed by pushing all of these different cultures into contact with each other, what Christianity said, love your enemies. And it was this idea of rising above our instinctive limits, which said human existence is tribal, and it's to say, no, we can achieve a universal morality that.
The Christians were,
but
slaves.
But so if there was this original enlightened vision with, as I described, its connections, for example, to Buddhism and to ancient Egyptian traditions, like if there was this complex forest ecosystem, then the Romans came along and they said, okay, we'll take that and we'll use it to defend our empire, and we'll have one truth, and if you disagree with that, then we'll kill you. And so it then became a basis of tribal solidarity in deep conflict with the original teachings.
The kind of progression we've made in terms of gender progression, gender equality, sexuality, all of these things have come through a secular society. They've not come through Christianity. The kind of equalities that we've achieved in our society, and for secular society, we would get more equality. We try to deal with racism, which, that wasn't coming through Christianity.
Well, Martin Luther King is an example of somebody directly using the gospel to campaign against racism. And Christianity, despite support for slavery in some contexts, was also led some of the campaign against it. But okay.
What about individual that each of us will one day pass away, and that's not saying we can debate whether it's true or not, as some people might. That's a natural thing. It's also a spiritual reality in many people's minds. In others, it's just the end and there's nothing after that. But isn't there some sort of macro-micro parallel going on between these two, like the end of the world paradigm and the end of ourselves? And isn't that something we might want to consider, the psychological dimension of that?
I suppose I like to look at the apocalyptic material in a positive framework, and it's quite interesting that if you read the Revelation, that it's not about the destruction of the earth, but about the salvation of the earth. And so for example, one of my favorite lines in the Revelation is that the wrath of God is against those who destroy the earth. And that's a line that the wrath of God is against those who destroy the earth. It's, I can probably give you the chapter, but in Revelation, yeah. And it's a line of thinking that really conflicts with the dominant narrative in Christianity, because Christianity has taken the idea, subdue the earth. And so it's the imperial colonial model of Christianity has created a really strong alienation between nature and spirit. And a part of, I would say, a part of that alienation between spirit and nature has been in the mythology of the afterlife. So people say, people use the concept of going to heaven as an emotional comfort. And I would prefer to say that all of the discussion of heaven in the Bible is intended in an allegorical way, and not as a literal claim, but because it was so emotionally powerful as a literal teaching, it became the dominant dogma. So, heaven and hell, they're symbols. They're not places, and so you have to explore. What do heaven and hell symbolize? And the Lord's Prayer says, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So it's a prayer for the transformation of our planet to make it more suitable for human existence. It's not about, we don't pray, may we go to heaven. We pray, may we transform our world to make it like heaven. Well, his 7 sermons for the dead were written in about 1917 in the midst of the First World War. And I think that the war was a really apocalyptic event in many ways. And so people were in a sense of despair. There was also the break that Jung had with Freud in the years before the war. And so the rejection of his idea that spiritual symbols are central to psychology. So he was quite isolated in that sense. And so looking at it as eschatology, which is, the theory of end times, it's quite plausible to see him, having dark thoughts around that sort of question and just wondering, what's the potential for humanity to escape from this catastrophe.
The world descending into the universal order, of course, is
Yeah.
It's let's say that you can't be stopped, not the young people, with ideas and methods, and you'll overthrow all the old fogies that have this negative idea or that can't be done and all this. Yes.
I mean, a lot of it boils down to us listening to each other.
Yeah.
Exchanging ideas and learning from each other and building knowledge.
I don't know if this thing works.
I don't think it works.
It's for the Zoom. It's for the Zoom recording. I should have mentioned that. But Jane.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and I'd like to thank Robbie for doing a fabulous job tonight and awakening us into more of these issues that are coming forward with the climate change and also with our lifestyle and a way of life and the floods and the water. Our daughter in Central Coast said, "Mum, I wish it would stop raining." It's raining and raining and raining. Torrential falls of rain overnight. She's a walker, a long distance runner. And she said, "Mum, I'm showing you these photos because I can't believe it. I'm walking along the beach and the waves are enormous and all this froth and bubble is going on. And what is going on here?" That's what her comment was. So it's pretty amazing, isn't it? She's experiencing it every day. And she said, "Please, God, please make the rain stop." And then Lismore, it's all coming again. And yes, that's right. Several of them, I think we might need. Anyway, thank you very much for coming and making such a wonderful evening for us all. And we look forward to you coming again. And Robbie, thank you very much. This is a very small token of your wonderful inputs into so much. You've given us so much tonight and so much to think about. We have to go home and do lots of reading and lots of checking on things around the world. Yes. Thank you. And also I'd like to say on the 6th of May, we have Padma Menon is coming. She is a dance as an embodied inquiry into consciousness. I think she'll probably have something a little bit different, but we'll put that in because she didn't tell us. But she's a very amazing lady. She's got a lot to offer us as well. So if you're around at that time, you're very welcome to come along and make a nice evening. Thank you very much. It's just so lovely to see new people coming in the door, and we really like that happening. And Francis there, if you're selling some books up there, if you want to go and talk to Francis. In the news age, whereabouts? Oh, Dixon has them. Yeah, oh, that's great. Anyway, thanks very much for coming along tonight. And
thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.